Sense. I'm Jacob Kishere, Culture Pilgrim, and I'm out here in Virginia, in the Lynchburg, with OG Rose. Mr. Daniel Garner is here. We are literally on the farm. We are in the barn because we thought it might rain. And it's a really rich setting for a conversation on education, which we have been having ongoingly on SENSESPACE. We've got a series of which this is going to be a part, past future education. We've been holding that also in dialogue with Tim Kubik. And today we wanted to pick that up. We've been having a lot of dialogues the last few days about the big transition going on in education that we can perceive and are sensing into around the move from teaching to facilitation as two very distinct forms of education, as different educational cultures. And beyond that, we're probably also going to explore the role of the liminal web and what kind of new educational culture, platform, and contexts of lifelong learning and character development and really full spectrum development is becoming available largely outside of traditional learning, higher learning institutions. So with that, welcome, Daniel.
Jacob Kishere, always good to speak with you. Education's really important. Yeah, and I think one of the keys, to education that kind of opens when we talk about liminal web and new forms of education, we mentioned it with Tim. I always love speaking with Tim, so thank you for the connections to make that possible, is that you're not merely taught what is directly told, but you're also taught the container that you are in. And, like we mentioned with Tim, and this is based on Neil Postman's idea, is that most of the time the classroom teaches you an educated person is good at trivia. Teacher has a question, who can answer it first? Random questions on a test, who can answer them? And there's a few things that indirectly says. One, somebody always knows the answer, the teacher. Two, education happens where there's an authority, the teacher. Three, education is about knowing the answers to random questions that somebody already knows the answer to. Four, the one who can answer the quickest wins. Five, being good at this game determines your socioeconomic fate, and I could keep going, right? There are other things. Postman says that education should be done with people of a similar age. Education should develop according to a yearly calendar. There's all these messages that you are indirectly taught about education. And honestly, you spend your entire life, not even often realizing it, but kind of subconsciously associating the point of reading, the point of learning is that, to do well in that kind of environment. Well, what if the environment of the world and society is not that environment? Well, then people stop learning. And people stop reading books. They stop being educated because the environment of the globe they go into is different from the environment of the classroom. And you are indirectly taught that the point of learning is for that classroom environment. And once you exceed in that classroom, that environment, and get out of it, you're done. You don't need to learn anymore. Yep. So with that kind of subconscious background, you can be told all the time, lifelong, it's good to read. It's good to have lifelong learning. It's good to stay up to date. Yeah, but your subconscious associations is you only do that in the classroom. You go, yeah, I already did that. I did that for 12 years. Absolutely. And you still do that in so much as when you get into small talk about the presidential election or small talk about what's going on in Europe with some, you have the right answers.
The right answer.
You have the headlines, right? And then you go back to work. So, I think the first thing that's just so important is that the difference between we can look at it this way. Teaching doesn't really draw attention to those kind of background associations. They're in the background associations, just like a fish is in water. Facilitation is where you're aware of the entire environment and what is being incubated and taught by that environment, and you use that like a musical instrument. Like you tap into that. You're aware of the things that you are teaching indirectly, the associations that you're creating in people and in yourself, as opposed to not really think about that. I doubt many teachers have ever thought of the fact that they are indirectly teaching that being good at trivia is what it means to be educated. I highly doubt. A facilitator is someone that is aware that you're trying to create a certain musicality of an environment. You're trying to be conscious of the kinds of associations you create. in people, and you want to facilitate good associations versus bad associations. So maybe we could say to start, and then I'll give it back to you. There's something about teaching that is the fish in water, where facilitation is the fish aware of the water that they are in. Which, of course, going to David Foster Wallace's famous example, that's pretty odd, right? Like, the old fish comes along and says to the younger fish, "The water's warm today, boys," and keeps swimming by, and the young fish look at one another and say, "What the heck is water?" And there's an idea then, therefore, that to move into facilitation is to move into maturity. It's to move into wisdom. It's to move into age. And I think collectively, especially with globalization, the meta, these kind of growing complexity, we're in an age where we can't be young fish anymore. We need to be like that old fish that knows he's swimming in water and is able to say the water is warm, and he's aware of the environment he's in. And I think that's kind of a collective wisdom step we need to move in.
Yeah, really well put, and thank you for opening that out. I think another piece I want to just dial back to, how are we being informed by the educational structure, implicitly, subconsciously? What's in the background? It's not just that education is trivia and we seek to have the right answer, or indeed going into further higher levels of education. We write an essay and our goal is really to show that we read as much material as possible and then we synthesized it into an argument. But it's not necessarily that we personally believe in that argument or that we went through any process of self-knowing through that. It's that the trivia is toward the objective of passing a test. The trivia is toward the objective of obtaining a qualification. The qualifications are toward the objective of university, and the university system today is toward the objective of a career.
Right.
So all of it is becoming quite utilitarian. It's for achieving a job, and ultimately in the economic environment that we're in, there's more and more incentive to think about education as a basis for career advancement. People will do a master's degree now as a kind of add-on because the value of the bachelor's degree is no longer there as it was. That's very different to learning for learning's sake. That's very different for learning as a process of self-cultivation, as a process of communal cultivation, as a way of knowing life more deeply, which would be the pursuit of wisdom, the cultivation of wisdom, the cultivation of character. And so I just wanted to kind of expand that a little bit. And then when we turn towards facilitation, it's very interesting how you've put it. There is a way in which education in modern context is really about what's in the foreground, and it ignores the background. It's not about really sensing into, the kid who actually had the awareness of how is the curriculum itself shaping me? How is the classroom itself shaping me? That kid, he needs to just kind of shut up and get on with it, because that's not an interest. That's not the right answer. That's not the right question. Whereas in an adult environment, particularly in a liminal environment, that's kind of the essential capacity that we're cultivating, is to recognize context as we are in it, as we are submerged in it. And that's really key, because the container, the background, is informing what can happen in the foreground. When it comes to politics, which is pretty universally considered to be broken in Western societies, the problems are unable to be resolved in the foreground, partly as a consequence to the background, whether that be the actual systemic background of all of the things you can't see around the democratic process, or literally in the space of dialogue itself. What is backgrounded? What's the implicit limitations of the form of dialogue, of the container, that prevent a real connection and breaking through of something new? So what's coming up for you here in relation to facilitation? From what I've understood from you over the last few days, you really have a sense that facilitation is actually going to really, really come to the fore, not just as this kind of countercultural, on the edge kind of thing, which it still is right now. There's a lot of people developing these capacities in the wild, outside of institutions. Some of them are then beginning to make the move of plugging into institutions again. You have people with these capacities coming back into education or consulting with companies, but it's still very much not understood what it is, why it's valuable, and certainly the idea that it's going to supplant traditional teaching, which is, okay, I have the knowledge and I'm here to impart it to you. That's a really radical notion.
No, absolutely. Excellent. Everything you said was absolutely excellent. I really like also this point where there's a difference between learning to do something external and learning for some sort of inner capacity. Now, again, we've all heard this idea that you should learn for learning's sake, not just a job and so on, but we've all just kind of secretly gone, okay, wink, wink, yeah, we know. That's what you're supposed to say. That's like the line, right? Mm-hmm. But what exactly is the difference between, and I think this will get at the claim of this supplanting, this radical supplanting that I think is indeed going to become more and more pronounced. When you are learning to do something, that means it's plannable. That means it's external, you can see it, you know what it is, and you're going for it. I think often, yeah, it's true, in college you write papers, but you tend to write papers, in all honesty, unfortunately, you tend to write papers based on what you think the professor would like and what they would grade. So there's still something even in that. That's an external awareness of a certain objective by a certain metric. And also it tends to be graded A, B, C, D, and even if you don't agree with the teacher's grading, there is still some sort of sense of a finality to the work. You know, you've got your grade, you either did good, you did bad, there's someone judging it who's qualified, and so there's this very external process. You don't have to internalize a judge, jury, and prosecutor. You don't have to internalize all of the steps of the creative process. There is something external to you, right?
Right.
So a way that we put in belonging again is the world is going to move more and more from planning, being the role of the human being to be good at planning, to being prepared. Because when we're talking about learning for learning's sake and holding a capacity, that may sound vague, but it's vague in the way that a surprise is vague. Like if something surprises you, you couldn't have known it was going to surprise you before it did, right? And yet surprises are very practical. People are surprised every single day. Things arise that people don't expect to rise every single day, right? So there's a way in which if I ask you to tell me right now something that's going to surprise you tomorrow, you couldn't do it. And yet tomorrow something probably will surprise you, right? So when we talk about capacity, what we're talking about is the ability of the human being to handle surprises, to meet surprises, to rise to their occasion, and to be able to do well. Now, we already had a conversation about self-defense. We talk all the time at OG Rose about self-defense, philosophy of self-defense. Well, self-defense is a kind of being able to handle a surprise, right? Likewise, if you're ready for pluralism, if you're ready for diversity, because you've grown the capacity of facilitation to enter into a space of the unknown, where nobody knows the answer, and you're able not to collapse into anxiety in that unknown, that's going to greatly increase your capacity to handle pluralism. The other thing is if AI is going to grow in prominence as a technology, well, anything that you can plan, AI can do better. Like if you're able to think it and plan it, then AI as a tool is going to be able to do it a whole lot better, right? And as that occurs, this is very important. As a technology arises that can do something, gradually and slowly it becomes irrational not to use it. This is a dynamic that Ivan Illich described, where if you have a supermarket, to go to the store, then it's kind of irrational to learn to hunt, right? You could learn to hunt, but there's a way in which it's kind of socially odd by which to engage in this activity, right? Maybe you do it because you still see value in it. Maybe you think the food at the grocery store isn't good for you. But there's a way in which when the technology arises, it shifts the horizon of what's a good use of time and what's not, what's a good use of time and what's a bad use of time. Well, as AI is able to ChatGPT answer any questions of trivia better than you, as it is able to create plans better than you, as it is able to think about, what you should do, then really what's going to be very important is for the human to be prepared for what the AI doesn't calculate, what the AI can't think of. And those are going to be the true surprises. They're going to be very deep surprises. In fact, they could be really, really tough surprises in different ways, right? Furthermore, the human capacity to be ready for the unexpected is precisely for the human to trace out a domain that the AI doesn't enter, because the AI tends to be sent in the direction that the human sends it in, right? And also, too, if I'm dealing with you and I say, wait a minute, Jacob, let me check my AI to figure out how I should respond to you, that's going to artificiate the relationship quite quickly, right? I need to be able to respond to you live as we encounter one another and as we're talking, right? So human capacities of facilitation and surprise become very necessary for increasing the quality of the relationship. It becomes precisely what humans, the way of thinking that AI cannot engage with. It also certainly is going to tie the other issue is that if we think about creativity, like there's more and more emphasis that as AI comes into prominence, that human creativity is going to be really important. What is human creativity but a certain cultivation of an inner space that is able to give forth something new and unexpected, right? So facilitate, but the funny thing about creativity is you really can't plan for creativity, right? You can plan and create the conditions that can incubate creativity, but the thing that comes out in the creativity is not so much planned, right? You've either done the work to have this thing within you that can come out in an unexpected way or not, right? So if there's this idea that AI is going to give us more time, there's going to be, unemployment even, and that human creativity is going to be central, well, then everything becomes about creating the conditions that increase the probability of that creativity coming out, right? Well, that's a classroom matter. That's a facilitation matter.
Yeah.
That's a creating a space for people so that they can actually come to terms with giving themselves over to the creative process. Because that would be a key way to think about it. Facilitation is ultimately facilitating a giving over. Like a creative process is something you give yourself to more than will. Like when you are like, I'm going to write a really good short story, I'm going to come up with a good entrepreneurship, it tends to be bad. There has to be an idea that hits you, that you go, and you give yourself to it. Well, that's a vulnerability. That is an emotionally difficult thing that if you have no training in, the likelihood of you doing is much lower. Like you meet people all the time that say, I always wanted to do poetry. I always wanted to do that idea, but they never gave themselves over to it. Well, one of the reasons they did is because, throughout their entire education, they were told that's impractical. They were told, their family maybe made them feel silly to engage in those things. So there are certain emotional tensions, psychological tensions that you've got to be able to handle and face if you're going to be able to give yourself over to something. Like likewise, if you're going to be able, and then I'll give it back to you, if, there's this big problem with pluralism today, diversity, right? Well, if you're going to be able to give yourself over to another person who believes something different than you, if you're able to give yourself over to a conversation, if you're not able to do that, it's going to be very difficult to have hard conversations that might draw into question things you believe, that brings you face to face with people that you don't fully understand. If you're not just able to give yourself over, then it's going to be very hard for pluralism not to turn into tribalism, for us to be able to give ourselves over to the environments that carve out a space for the human independent of AI. And it's going to be difficult for us to give ourselves over ultimately to something bigger than ourselves.
Yeah, wonderfully put. I think the thing that's most alive for me here is thinking about the role of progressivism in culture today and how essential facilitation is to that matter. When you think about something like the notion of diversity and inclusion, that's ultimately an attempt to address pluralism.
Yeah.
It's an ethos around pluralism, and it requires some sort of capacity and skill to mediate difference, which requires encounter with difference, which is not really a propositional kind of thing. It's an experiential encounter, and by virtue of being different, we don't actually know one another. So we have to kind of enter the space of not knowing one another to find out where those differences may lie. If we do not have the capacity for facilitation, if we don't have the capacity for this kind of emergent dialogue type space, if we don't have all of the many levels of skills involved in that, what you essentially have is power games, which ironically is precisely the critique that progressives and students on campuses today are leveling against Western culture. They're saying it's all just power games underneath. That's the underlying basis. But very few of them, from my standpoint, are actually cultivating the capacity to participate in something that is not power games. So what you get instead is emotionally or ideologically charged activists and strategic and self-interested bureaucrats in a kind of back and forth with one another. And there isn't this kind of mutual vulnerability. There's a lot of actual fear, coercion, pressure, and ultimately what it leads to is I think it's choice falsification is Timur Kuran's word for it, but effectively people lie.
Yep.
And they say things that aren't true because it's in service of their strategy. And again, to refer back to the whole political situation today, there's an enormous amount of dishonesty that's being sustained. And fortunately, due to the explosion of information, dishonesty is exposed. But how do we actually get to a place where we're able to have honest conversations? That requires facilitation. Because actually, to be honest, without that is to put yourself in a really precarious position, and more often than not, you haven't actually cultivated the capacity to be honest, because that's not something that you just switch on and off.
Exactly.
That's the summation, that's the fruit of participating in a facilitated kind of space where you choose to make that step towards being more honest, really sensing into how you feel, what's present for you, and being able to articulate that, forthrightly and vulnerably at the same time.
I think that's brilliantly put. I would just say, I can't just choose to be able to swim. I can't just choose to be able to drive a car, right? You have to train. Yet we treat all of the emotional skills, the personal skills, and social skills as merely a matter of choice. You choose to be vulnerable. Just choose to be vulnerable. Just choose to be open. Just choose not to be afraid. It's not like that. Like, those are capacities. But you see, if we think they're just matters of choice, vulnerability you either choose to or not, well then what we're doing is setting people up to fail. Ultimately what we're doing is setting people up to only end up with people like them, and we are setting people up to ultimately fail to be fully human. These things that we are describing, that are vulnerability, openness, relationality, creativity, these are all things that you don't simply choose to do. Nothing else in life is like that, but when it comes to the human being, for some reason we have a metaphoric structure where we think about it. Generally, the average person thinks of it as merely a choice. You choose it or not. No, it has to be facilitated. But then, of course, maybe one of the reasons we've metaphorically treated like an on or off switch is because we haven't had people able to facilitate it at scale. We have not had the infrastructure for that possibility, nor has it even occurred to us. Because if we've mostly existed in an economic paradigm of the Industrial Revolution, then the way we train people is to be teachers, not to be facilitators, right? So if we're in this, as Zach Stein might put it, between worlds, we're in a transition phase between the teacher to the facilitator. Because now these skills are more necessary than ever. I mean, another way to put it is basically all the major problems, which is a huge claim, basically all the major problems that people are talking about, diversity, AI, creativity, collapsing economic, because Tyler Cohn and Peter Thiel talk about the stagnation. There's this economic stagnation occurring. I would argue all of these are a result of a lack of facilitation. That they are all a result of the same problem, which is that we have to somehow train an inner space that we've never really had to train before. We've had to train people to physically be able to do things. But what does it mean to incubate people to be creative? Like, that's very odd. Like, what does it mean to incubate people to be vulnerable? That, again, is very odd. It's not even self-evident what those skills are exactly. It's not even, it's obvious the skills you need to solve a math problem. It's obvious the skills you need to read Shakespeare. It's obvious the skills you need to drive a car. Some more so than others, but generally you kind of have a sense. But I would say we need the skills to be vulnerable. Mm-hmm. Okay, but here's like the key problem. Everyone thinks they're vulnerable. Like, this is the problem. Like, everyone thinks they're a pretty good friend. Everyone thinks they're, like, not self-deceived. They don't. Who thinks I'm an ideologue? I'm tribal. I hate diversity. Like, I've never met anyone who thinks they dislike this thing. The reason why facilitation is so important is because of the problem of self-deception. And also the inability to know if you don't have these abilities. The advantage of things external from you, and then I'll give it back to you, if you don't know the math problem, you can't self-deceive yourself. It's right in front of you. You obviously cannot. If you're not able to drive a car, you obviously cannot. There's the objective reality test, if you will, right? When it comes to things like vulnerability, diversity, tribalism, political, dialogue, these are things that even if you do a bad job of, you don't necessarily realize you did a bad job at, right? And you easily self-deceive yourself without even meaning to self-deceive yourself, because if you know you're self-deceiving yourself, you're not self-deceiving yourself. That's the whole weird meta thing, right? Like, it is not, you could easily go your entire life without ever realizing you don't have these capacities, right? And that's where we have quite a challenge here, like, because we have to create infrastructure that allows people to have tests of themselves regularly, to actually experience themselves either having these capacities or not, but not in a way that then makes them feel like a failure, right? Because, like, right now, if you fail at being diverse, for example, well, then you may lose your position in college. You might be called a racist, you might get really angry and people, like, attack you, or you blow up, right? You're not given a space to, like, figure out how to have a dialogue, to figure out how to be open to the other. There's certainly no test, and critically, you don't want a society that simply has tests. You want tests for the sake of training. But that requires a regular infrastructure like the liminal web. That requires a regular space to go into so that you can continually get better and better and better. Testing that ultimately isn't for the sake of improvement is simply a burden, or simply something that's going to create misery for people. So you have to have an infrastructure as well.
Yeah, that's when you think about diversity and equity, how it's being propagated and promoted as an attempt to progress culture. It's being propagated through attempting to change people's ideas.
Yes.
When you have a company that wants to address this issue, they bring in a program officer, and that person is responsible for propagating the correct ideas on how to relate to this and instituting some policies. What we're talking about is deeper than that, and I would say more necessary. It's not about having the correct ideas. It's about having the proper capacity to participate in the space where ideas are formed, and to actually be in the space of mediation of ideas.
That's right.
And then the matter of creativity for me is really interesting here, because we don't often think of education and creativity as going together. Right. It's often, if you're an artist, it's because you dropped out, it was something that was on the side. But the creative process is obviously essential to human life. It's essential in so many different aspects, down to the minute properties of our own lives and the choices we make, down to our ideas, our capacity to make sense of reality. If reality appears to be broken, if our life appears to be broken, if things seem to be stuck, creativity is the ultimate arbiter. Right. It's the ultimate dissolver of that. It's the thing that gets us into a new place, sometimes by dissolving an arbitrary boundary that we thought was important, sometimes by putting things together and in relationship that we thought was separate. And that requires a particular kind of mind, and that's a kind of mind that arises in a particular kind of space. What we call a liminal space, a space that is a kind of in-betweenness. It's not so strictly defined. It's not, we are gathered here to obtain these particular learning objectives, and simply that's our A to B. Now, this is more like a to question mark process, which we enter into again and again. I liked what you were saying, almost a sense of training that we need a safe, safe space.
Sure.
We need a safe space to fuck up, and to go through that process and become skillful in that, just like children need to, be in a space of play, in a space of creativity, where the rules of the game are not strictly defined. They need to be able to play around and create new games.
Yep.
I would say as adults, we're really struggling both to play and to create new games, collectively and societally.
I think so. I think you said a lot there that was spot on. If you have an unsolvable problem, by definition, creativity is the only way you can deal with it. But creativity seems impossible you can't just will creativity. So we have an issue. Right. Like, we have we have a problem that is more of a matter of architecture and space than it is information. There's a gentleman, his name's Dr. James K. Smith. He did a lovely book called You Are What You Love. He also has a more expansive series called Desiring the Kingdom. And we could also think about various people emphasizing architecture like Sloterdijk, Alexander, etc., so forth. But anyway, Dr. Smith says human beings are primarily not matters of information but formulation, and that we don't think enough about what formulates us because we're too focused on information. You were saying that a lot of diversity initiatives now about the right ideas. Religions have made that mistake. A lot of the mistakes. He's critiquing Christianity. He says Christianity is way too concerned about the right beliefs, dogma, than it is worship. He wants to focus on formulation. So it's very interesting because you actually have a similar mistake that's manifesting over and over again in many different areas. Politics, religion, college, it doesn't matter, because they're all, in a way, circling the same problem, which is how do we become intentional about formulation and facilitation. This is, by definition, a paradox. You said something exactly right, that in the liminal you're dealing with something kind of fuzzy, right? And that in of itself may sound fuzzy, but a way to kind of frame the problem is, how do you talk about context? Because the moment you talk about context, is it not a subject? How do you become intentional about context and environment without at the same time making it not environment, but in fact the focus, right? Like, how do you make context, the moment you talk about context, it's kind of text in a more Derridian way, right? So this is the problem. We're talking about a thing that the moment you talk about it, there's a way in which you're not talking about it anymore, in this kind of meta way, which creates a certain confusion. So we have to become intentional about something. We move into the foreground that we then release to go back to the background, which right there has a certain releasing. There's a holding and releasing. That one is scary, one is unnatural, and how can we be sure that we did it right before we let it go and try, right? So there's a lot of fear there. Now, first off, the very nature of expensive economic programs is that you can't release them. Like, you've spent $100 million on building this college. We need to make sure it works, right? So one of the things is whatever we're talking about is going to need a certain flexibility to it, which means it's going to need to be a low capital. It can't be high capital, high expense, because there has to be a lot of experimentation to it, right? Well, not to cut ahead, this is one of the reasons why the liminal web is a big deal, because yes, it costs money to have Zoom. Yes, it costs money to have the internet, but not nearly as much as building a college campus, right? So there's a certain ability there to experiment, to release, to experiment. And really, if today has a lot to do with facilitation, and facilitation has this grasp-release structure to it, then you needed a low-capital infrastructure in order to not be overly invested in one of those things you grip and then release, right? That wasn't possible till now. Now we have the ability to relatively easily speak with someone all around the world, where if you think about it, for the last 100 years ago, if you wanted to speak with someone on the other side of the world, that's pretty expensive. That's pretty time-consuming, and it was a heck of an investment, right? So if there's some sort of experimentation of pluralism that is needed before, how could you in the past have experimented with diversity in a non-cost-heavy, time-consuming way? And maybe you could do it, I don't know, 1 week out of a year when you're on vacation from your job, right? Simply was not the infrastructure for this kind of experimentation of grasp-release to work with the fuzzy logic. I've heard people call it fuzzy logic, right? Well, fuzzy logic is not something you can play with, unless you have low costs, right? Like relatively low cost. And now there is. And it should also be noted that a lot of the cost is the internet that most people are getting anyway for their job. They're not getting it just to do liminal web stuff, right? So you're not asking people to spend an extra $50 a month or $100 a month. They're already doing it, right? And a lot of jobs are increasingly asking for Zoom, right? And most people have a YouTube account, right? So the other reason we should just kind of look at this logistical situation that's arising is the liminal web is asking people to use things they already have, already are invested in, to use it in a manner that incubates and facilitates versus, hey, spend an extra $1,000 a month or something like that, right? And that's really important because that's another reason why this is also possible. You're asking people to work with things that they already have. and to use them in a manner that is different, just to use them in a manner that's different to facilitate. But in order to do that, here's the issue. You're asking people to use things they already have to explore fuzzy logic, which, of course, how do you use a fuzzy logic to convince people to engage in a fuzzy logic, right? Mm-hmm. Well, by participation, right? And participation is something that people need to see. They need to see people participating as an exemplar for them themselves to see the possibility of them doing it, right? So this is where the YouTube is important, because people can see it. And if they can see other people doing it, that it can increase their confidence of being willing to do it. And then they already have the infrastructure to do it, right? So you put those together and you start creating an environment. And ultimately, if the movement is from the right ideas to the right subjectivity, then it has to be environmental. It has to be an environmental that is incubating in people a different form, which then is a matter of facilitation. And if you do it, and then I'll give it back to you, if you do it, you can understand how it's possible to focus on context, to focus on background, and then release it. Then also the costs are low enough to where you can continually do it regularly. And then 3, you can see models of people doing it as well. Oh, this is what diversity looks like when it's not merely ideas. Oh, this is what creativity looks like when it's actually free and in community. I see it. Mm-hmm. So even though what's going on is by a fuzzy logic, fuzzy logics can become very clear embodied. This is very important. What is a fuzzy logic on paper is actually very concrete in person. Right? Like hip-hop ciphers in a way are fuzzy. We're just going to have stuff come off the dome. What does that mean exactly? Oh, I see. Like the only way to cover the gap between fuzzy logic is with participation, right? And so that's a way to kind of cross the gap. And then if that is all in place now, then it's all in place now for the possibility to, at scale, move the average person more so into a quote-unquote fuzzy logic that is necessary for the cultivation of capacities, which is the same problem appearing in politics, economics, school, everything, and it actually be concrete. You're in the age where this fuzzy logic can actually be concrete because you can see it. Just like you can see the cipher, you can see off the dome. And that opens possibilities.
Yeah, that's really wonderfully put. I think we see in this that there's a shift from a focus on doing to being, with the being actually more foundational to the doing. It's our state of being, it's our state of awareness, our level of consciousness that determines what's important, what we prioritize, and ultimately what arises out of that in terms of projects. Our collective action problems, a lot of them seem to be focused on, well, we need to do different things, but when we do different things, it still doesn't meet the problem. So there's something about being that the liminal facilitation process is actually the most profound and potent address that we've found, or even we've been given. And what you've identified there is really crucial, is that there's a kind of dual action going on here. There's the actual be-doing of it. There's the inviting people into it, the practice, the cultivation of it. And there's also a presentation of it, which is afforded by the new technology. You can both be doing it and presenting it at the same time without having to worry too much about the fact that you're presenting it. That's what podcasts offer us. So when we look more broadly, and we had a conversation the other day about the Zoom revolution, the podcast revolution, this shift from television into meme culture, and potentially from meme culture into also long-form dialogue culture vis-a-vis Joe Rogan and all the rest. The liminal web is kind of the dynamic beating heart of this new conversational culture. And the more impact that can have, the more likely you see that podcasts themselves begin to be a real primary medium where this is occurring. And so somebody who's in any given walk of life is more and more likely to be exposed secondarily through media, through watching, listening to Joe Rogan while they're at their job. They're being informed by a different way of participation. And I do think someone like Joe Rogan is already moving a little bit in that direction, although he's still an interviewer. He's creating a certain kind of open, unfolding space. So I want to kind of bring it to an area that's even more fuzzy for me then. as we kind of look, the series is past future education, as we're looking to this in the future. How does this get brought out is what's coming to me. I mean, you've already spoken to, we're doing it, we're exemplifying it, we're inviting, the exemplification, the beauty of the process is the invitation, and it's also being propagated, right?
Yep.
But then there's a way in which there is a problem of scale, you could say,
yep.
of, there's so many different contexts out there, inside of companies, inside of schools, inside of communities, inside of traditional higher education, and relationships, marriage counseling, you name it. There's all these contexts which demand this new capacity, for a kind of facilitated process rather than a taught process, a process that brings us into being and focusing on being rather than simply doing. How does the liminal web and its long-term cultivation of a scene and an environment which people can come into and learn, and it's certainly been something that's multiplying, growing, and particularizing before our eyes. There's many different kind of schools and spaces that have emerged. How does that kind of go out? What's that interaction with the larger scale? How does that relate to, say, sending out missionaries or sending out consultants? How does it kind of go outward into culture? And being a fuzzy question, of course, I don't expect you to have a highly specific answer to this, but it's the direction we're moving in now, and I think we have to kind of sense towards that.
Excellent. No, it's an excellent question. So a few things. You could argue, so it's hard to imagine basically anything human beings can do that does not involve learning to some degree. If you cooked in the kitchen, there was some learning that made that possible. If you walk upstairs to go use the bathroom, there was some learning how to walk. That was part of it, right? Like, arguably at the base of every single thing human beings do is learning, unless it's instincts. But, then we're talking animal, right? So that's the degree of the animal. So the human is fundamentally defined by learning, right? Which then the question is it a learning of information or formulation? Like, what is the main form of that learning, right? Well, for most of obviously it's both, but you can say that, like going back to our physics example, as you get older, it really should transition to where you're able to also think form. Like when you're a kid, you're being formed, your parents are forming you, they're nurturing you, then you enter into information. There's a way in which you return to formulation by being the parent who creates form. And so you can say that our culture is now needing to move into an elder stage, to be like creating environments. You can say, like we talk all the time with David Hume's Return to Common Life. You need to leave home to go on an adventure, but then if you never return and plant roots, there's a problem, right? Hegel will talk about the return. You could put the RE in parentheses, because when you return, you're never the same. We are really in an age where we've gone through an information age. People will talk that. Well, now we need to be the intentional formulation stage.
So
right?
Information age to formation age.
Yes. You could say we started in being formed, then we went to being informed, and now we need to move into formulating, like forming. And where we're participating in the forming, and we're also aware of what we're forming, right? We're thinking far more about the kind of environments we are creating and spaces we want to be made by than we are, do I have an answer to all the questions, right? Mm-hmm. We want to create the kind of subjects that move into the future to make it be the kind of future we want it to be. The future is not a matter of having the right information. The future is a matter of what we create tomorrow. Well, that means it's a matter of formulation, right? So the key thing to recognize on the problem of scale is that the moment we start talking about something educational and learning, you are talking about spreading something that is already at the root of all human action, right? So we're not talking about something additive. No problem of scale is going to work. No address to the scaling problem is going to work if you have to add something that is not already there in human life, right? So what's another thing that's already there in human life? Conversation. Mm-hmm. Talking, right? Mm-hmm. So if we're talking about a different way that people talk, you are talking about something that is already there. We're not asking to add something.
Yep.
Okay? So learning is already there. Speaking is already there. What's another thing that's already there? Relationships. If you don't have relationships, you end up as a wolf boy, right? Like humans don't formulate without relationships, right? But here's an issue. This is where they start to go together. One of the reasons people, there's a friend session going on where it seems like a lot of people don't have friends anymore. I think one of the reasons, it's obvious, Neil, bowling alone. It's the idea that people can watch TV so they don't go in the community. We don't have the communal resources and so on and so forth. But I'm not so sure, it's kind of chicken and egg problem. What came first? The loss of the communal resources that made people not have friends? Or was there something where people stopped having friends and so communal resources didn't go in that direction, right? It's obviously both. But one of the reasons why people don't necessarily seek friends is because they don't have anything to talk about. Or they don't have anything to do together. Most people's friends are their coworkers, right? Mm-hmm. Like they're people they work with and happen to be around. One of the things that the liminal web shows you is how, like, if you actually do philosophy or humanities or creative, you always have something to talk about. You have a reason to interact with people beyond you. And the other problem happens if people have friends and it's not philosophical in character, and by that I don't mean the study of the history of philosophy, but you could say depth exploring in character, liminal in character, then it tends to be about drama, problems, things that are going on. People are, there's a kind of, it's not necessarily beneficial. Mm-hmm. It can be gossipy, right? Well, then it's kind of ethical to cut off those relationships, right? Well, now you're alone. So, one of the reasons why you also need the liminal is to have a positive reason by which to engage with other people, right? But here's a problem. How do you get the material to talk about? You have to read books and you have to study. Well, why would you do that if it's not for your job, right? Like, why would you do that? Maybe you just happen to read that stuff. Maybe you just happen to have an innate interest. But why would you have the capacities to even enter into that conversation? And maybe you're not as far along as you're going to be, but where would you even get the starting spark, right? I think right now it's basically luck. Well, it's a lot of luck, and it's a lot of natural dispositions, right? But in addition to that is an infrastructural problem, which is there is no infrastructure that would sociologically create the conditions by which people can feel enabled or upheld if they were engaged in lifelong learning. Like right now, I think a lot of people have, in fact, deep interests and deep questions they want to answer, but it's not part of their job. They don't work at a college, and no one around them is interested in it as well. So they just kind of die out, or it becomes a personal hobby. But then if it's a personal hobby, it doesn't necessarily create community. Now, does it, right? Well, right now, if you're interested in reading Hegel and you work on Wall Street, you could get on the liminal web and find people all around the world who are interested in reading Hegel as well, right? Yep. And we learn from Peter Berger and all the sociologists that without that social support, it becomes incredibly difficult for a person to engage in those things. And in fact, even if they do, we were saying this the other night, it may just make them lonelier because now they're interested in deep things and no one around them are interested in these deep things. So they just feel lonelier, right? Because you didn't have a social coordinating mechanism by which to help people who are interested in X find other people interested in X. And now they can, and here's the thing, if you find 20 people around the world, I just use the Hegel example because, we do so much in Hegel, that are interested in reading Hegel, and they have their own interest, that will cultivate one, it will be encouraging, two, it will work on your inner facilities, and three, it will change how you experience the world. And that actually can help you with the guy at the barbershop. That, in fact, can help you with the guy at the store. That helps you outside of that space. And here's the thing, the final, to this all, because now there's this kind of missionary issue that you were mentioning, right? You spread the word about something. You spread something by telling people about it or showing it. You tell or show, right? If you go into the barbershop and you have a different quality of life, a different shine, then people see that. And they're attracted to it, and they want to be like it. And you have an evangelism of shine, if you will. The most ineffective evangelism is telling people, hey, you ought to join the liminal web. Why? Why not join something else? There's a million products out there, right? Well, I don't tell you to join anything. You just see a difference that then attracts you in, right? And shine, as I'm describing it there, is a matter of formulation, not information. Mm-hmm. So the mode of the spread is like the thing that's being spread. The form and the message are together. The meaning and the message are together, right? Yeah. So as you cultivate different people that shine with a different quality of engagement, that in of itself is a testament a testimony to the thing those people are doing that then attracts people in. If you encounter people who shine with a genuine, wow, they're engaging with diversity because they seem to really thrive on it, not because they're guilted. How do they do that? How are they able to? I'd like to be able to do that, but I still actually just feel guilt-based. I just feel like I'm supposed to do it.
Yeah.
Well, you see something that attracts you in. So the liminal web has to spread through a shine attraction, which is shining with the thing that is cultivated in the space that is possible because of a social coordination mechanism that is based on always already human conditions of relationality, conversation, and learning. Those things are already at play. You're simply creating a coordination mechanism to realize them according to a different and new form that is creating a new capacity to make people able to handle pluralism, creativity, and different things like that. And so that's why it can be an address to this problem of scale.
Yeah. Well, thank you. I think I just, maybe a closing reflection here for me is that the quality of this project, this new quality of education, this new way of participation, is intrinsic. We talk about liminality, being between states, between categories. It truly is that, and what you've just said speaks to that really in a profoundly pronounced way. It has the potentiality and the potency to address a multiplicity of different dimensions of life at the same time. And so it's not really about an address to the problems of modern education solely through changing education. When you can address this thing, this foundational level of being, when you can change the subjectivity, the quality of consciousness, the quality of relationship and participation, that does go into the barbershop, that does go into the family, which is also a very important structure and foundation of society. It does go into the education, and it does go into the workplace. So it's a profound medicine in a way. It has that mycelial quality. It has that fungal quality in which it is kind of connecting. The liminal web isn't like, oh, I'm just a aloe vera plant, and I only do this one thing and fruit in this way at this time. It's much closer to a fungal network in that it is coming into relationship with all different things, and it's creating this dynamic range of relationships and bringing them into this interconnectivity, into this shared network of a possibility of exchange. And ultimately, it's the quality of that network of exchange, of coming together and participating, that is rich. It's self-evidently valuable. And it's precisely for that reason that we are here today having this conversation in person, because the value of the quality of dialogue in the spaces has generated a sufficient quality of friendship that I love to come out here and visit you guys and develop this further. And there is a sense that this is something that can be built long into the future. It's because it's intrinsically worthwhile. There's no sense of like we're kind of just in on this together in order to get this business project done, or for the particular objective. It's a friendship based,
Yes.
And a community based kind of relationship, which I think is really important and is abiding and something that's desperately needed in a context of culture splitting and fragmentation and conflict, where difference really can't be held.
I think that's beautifully put, and I feel the exact same way. So I'm so glad you're here. As a closing way to put it, basically, the only way to deal with a lot of these tensions is a question of vibes. You know how people say there are good vibes here, there are bad vibes here, there's a good flow, dialogos is a vibe. There's a way in which friendship is a vibe versus association. When people talk about value versus just money, like, oh, there's a sense of value, that's a kind of vibe, there's a kind of metaphysical basis. Basically what we're talking about is we're in the age where we have to be able to effectively cultivate and coordinate vibe creation, a certain feeling, which is energy, right? We were talking about energy flow, right? Basically, when businesses, like, if this all sounds vague, which it kind of has to be, that's kind of the point, it has to be vague because it is something that defines every possible phenomenon. Therefore, if it was specific, it couldn't be widely applied. Vagueness is the character of anything that can be widely applied, right? How do businesses form teams? By people that work together. What the heck does that mean? It tends to mean vibe. It doesn't mean merely like they're able to get the project done, because the vibe is why they're able to get the project done, right? Like, why do you hang out with certain versus other? It's because there's a certain vibe that's created. There's a certain field that's created, a certain energy that's created, right? You're not going to overcome problems of diversity if people don't feel a good vibe in the diverse. But diversity, by definition, is hard. It tends to create anxiety versus a good vibe, right? Like a good atmosphere, a good energy, right? The only way you can create a positive energy or strong energy or vibe in a place that doesn't naturally create that energy is by work. Right now, you tend to feel good around people that are like you, right? Or that get you socially acknowledged. Well, that means you're going to be in a tribe, and that means you're going to have a job that capitalism likes and may be contributing to global warming or something, right? So, the things that create a good vibe tend to be what is plugging up into the problem, right? Well, vibe also tends to create, motivation. People tend to be motivated by what they feel vibe in or they feel good in, right? Yeah. So if we want to change the incentive structure away from that which is unsustainable or tribalistic or all of that, if we want to move incentives in a alternative direction, some people call it a game B, some people call it an address to the meta, whatever you want to call it, all of that is a matter of incentives. But you see, in incentives, we think capitalism and paycheck, right? People, I think, if they knew how to experience vibes, would happily emphasize the incentives of vibes over the incentives of a paycheck. 100%. We just don't know how to do that. But now we have the infrastructure to do that. And so if we own that and we coordinate and we incubate that, well, now you move people to a different world. Yeah. Because it has a better vibe.
Well, this has always been the case for artists throughout history. Musicians have always known this. They've always known that the fire, the energy, the aliveness of participating in the vibe, in the unfoldment of music with others is infinitely more valuable than almost anything else. And so they're willing to undertake more difficult conditions. Yes. They're willing to put music first. They're willing to put the vibe that animates their life prior to the economic condition and the other things. What's different about this is we've actually been cultivating and participating in a context where the same becomes true of dialogue. The same becomes true of relationship. And so it's possible to tap into the musicality of life, the musicality of being, the artistry of being, through dialogue, through participating in a certain kind of space. And that changes everything.
That changes everything. And what I would just say is, when you go through history, most artists and intellectuals, what would they do? They'd move to a city. They'd find the network. They'd find the Bloomsburg group. They'd find the Vienna Circle, right? This finding the vibe was geographically bound for basically all of history. Now it is not. And not only is it not, it can be recorded to show people it happening. Imagine if you had videos of the Bloomsbury group, if you had videos of the Scottish, if you had videos of these things. We don't. Now we do. And people can see the dialogue and do that. And also, I'll let the book expand on it, there is very good evidence that literally transformations in how people talk with one another gave you the great enrichment that Dietrich McCloskey talks about in the Dutch Empire. It gave you new political economy. It gave, Habermas talks about commutative rationality as the only possibility of democracy. The fate of human beings is strongly tied to how they talk with one another, right? And the way artists and creatives talked with one another is different than how most people have talked with one another. But in order to find the networks where they could cultivate that for basically all of history until now, it was very geographically bound. Yeah. Because you had no effective vibe coordination system, if you will. You had no effective way to coordinate vibes. Now that exists. We've had a pricing mechanism to coordinate resources in economics, Friedrich Hayek. We've had a way to coordinate limited resources, but we've never had a way to coordinate, dare I say, limited vibes. And I use the word vibes toward the end here because vibes is something I think people know. They know a good vibe, right? What if you could coordinate vibes? Oh, and here's the other thing. Vibes, when you coordinate them, are not limited. It turns out they spread themselves. Whereas, maybe oil is limited or wood or something when you coordinate it. But vibes are not the kinds of phenomenon that are necessarily scarce. Oh, and here's the other key characteristic of a vibe. When I use up a limited resource like electricity, I lose it, right? It goes away.
and it loses value. Like if there's a lot of electricity, it has what? Less value, right? So companies have incentives to create scarcity, right? Here's a key about Vibe. It doesn't lose value at all. No matter how many people have it, no matter how many people are there, it does. Scarcity does not increase the value of Vibe. In fact, Vibe tends to go up when you have a lot of people. Vibe, the value and the experience of the artistic network increases the more people that are involved. Whereas our current economic paradigm is scarcity is how you create value. You need a limited amount of the good in order to make a good profit from it. A Vibe goes up in value. It is a non-zero sum phenomenon, where most economics today is based on zero sum. So we're talking about the coordination of the spread of a Vibe, which is non-zero sum, that people would prefer to money anyway. And that would actually create incentives away for the consumption structure, the way of engagement that leads to geopolitical tension, unsustainable economic consumption, and a way of engaging with people that feels very artificial, because people feel like they just engage with one another like consumers, right? Well, if they had a structure that would help train and coordinate them to engage with one another like artists in the Bloomberg group, artists in these great networks that we look back on, that would be a very different world. That would be a world that would have a much different vibe than the apocalypse that people talk about right now. That would be a world in which it really would feel like anything was possible. And I do think anything is possible if we just simply become intentional about spreading the conditions in which incubate within us the hope and creativity by which to make anything possible. And I do think that's possible today.
Yeah. It strikes me also that when we think about something like the Bloomsbury Group, we don't just remember the individuals. We don't just remember the characters. We remember the network.
Exactly.
And we understand the primacy of the network. And a high-potency network can be, the fountainhead of an entire field, even an entire era. Think about like the group around C.S. Lewis and Tolkien, for example. And of course, when we speak about vibes, there's something very beautiful here, which speaks to the kind of fractal quality of the whole liminal web idea, is that vibes is something everybody understands. Everybody senses vibes. Everybody knows good vibes, bad vibes, sketchy vibes. But we also, I think, fair to say, hold that there's a much deeper understanding of vibes, vibrations.
100%.
There's a
100%.
foundational quality to vibe and frequency, actually, to reality itself.
Exactly.
And lastly, just to really clarify this in case anybody was confused, because I know we've spoken a lot about diversity, the tendency towards groupthink, and how we need a capacity to come together in pluralism. This kind of vibe attractor is not fundamentally about everyone thinking the same.
Exactly.
Or even having the same vibe. It's not about having the same vibe.
Right.
As probably is demonstrated in this video.
Yeah.
We're giving out different vibrational frequencies. Yes. It's about the capacity to harmonize.
Exactly. It's the harmony.
Different vibes.
Yes.
And
exactly.
When you think about instruments, right, there's very, very different sounds. There's conflicting sounds, but there's an art to bringing them together and bringing more instruments, more sounds in, bringing more discordance into harmony.
Exactly.
Creates a more expansive music. And so that's an amazing, amazing property of the liminal web and of the potential future of education. So with that, if you have any final words, you're very welcome to add to that. But this has been incredible.
It has been wonderful. And, just something, I'm glad you made that clarification, because that's very important. When we talk about a vibe, it's the harmony. Like in Belonging Again, we talk about the difference between isolation, singularity, and harmony. Like isolation is where you're alone playing your instrument. Singularity is where everyone on stage is playing the violin. And harmony is where you have different instruments. But if people have different instruments, then you have to overcome your own insecurity about that difference, learn to work with them. It's a more difficult process.
It's a very relational
process.
It's
extremely relational, but it's why Beethoven's Ninth becomes possible, for example. The other thing that I think is just extremely important, when you read a book like Randall Collins does a lot on the history of networks and different things, we today tend to look at the Bloomsbury Group as kind of a collection of the all-stars. Oh, Virginia Woolf's hanging out with Keynes and, Bertrand Russell and et cetera, et cetera. Critically, it was coming together that made them the all-stars.
Ah, okay.
That then
Okay.
afterwards makes it seem like the reason they came together is because they were all-stars.
Yeah.
But it was actually the coming together that was first. That is correct. Now, the reason they came together and were able to become ultra all-stars is because they already had some capacity.
Yeah.
But the capacity went to the next level, the next deep level of friendship and ability because of the coming together. But we have never had a coordination mechanism to do that at scale. It's always been if you just happen to live near Cambridge, if you happen to live near Massachusetts. That's why colleges for most of history have had this critical function of geographic coordination. But funny enough, the real action on the colleges tend to happen off campus, but it was the gathering to the college that allowed there to be somewhere near it that was able to bring those people together. But funny enough, it's often just like the Inklings you mentioned the pub, right? Like different, it's the same thing. So once you get that, once you understand, oh, it's the coming together that then leads to the next level, that in of itself creates hope. Because you say, well, I'm not Tolkien, I'm not yeah, they weren't either at the time. Lewis was not Lewis at the time. Tolkien was not Tolkien at the time. He's not writing Lord of the Rings till much later in life. I mean, you know, it's not early in life he's writing that stuff. C.S. Lewis isn't a big deal early in life. Most of these people are not. The coming together changes things. But that is a the final thing I'll say is that is a sociological problem. You need the infrastructure to make that possible. That is not geographically bound. You need the infrastructure that allows people to learn capacity so that they can come together. They need to be able to see people engaged in lifelong learning for learning's sake. Because if you don't see people doing that, and then in midlife, if you don't have access to a liminal web or a college, how are you going to engage in learning for learning's sake, especially with other people? Maybe you get lucky and have a reading group in the local community, but you probably live in a city then. So that's geographically bound, right? That tends to be isolation. So you need that. And then you also have to have a sense that you will form friendships if you do this, because people naturally seek relationships, and you can see this occurring. So you can see the friendship, you can see the possibilities there. You put all those things together, and there's reason to hope. There's reason to hope.
There's reason to hope.
There's reason to hope.
Awesome. Well, thank you all for listening and joining us. This has been SENSESPACE with Daniel Garner in the form of OG Rose.
Thank you all.
Meow, 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 meow.
Meow. Meow.
Meow, 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 meow.
Meow meow.
Meow. Meow, 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 meow. Meow, 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 meow. Meow, 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 meow. All right.